ever been in that kind of high-stakes situation, a struggling business unit, maybe a strained relationship, or a job that was just, well, clearly not working out, and you knew with absolute certainty that you needed to pull the plug, that you
Yeah.
had to make a drastic decision and just commit to a final outcome. But instead of making that single, hard, definitive choice, you chose the middle ground, the soft option. You tried to pull that professional or personal Band-Aid off slowly, right? Hoping to minimize the short-term discomfort.
And what was the result? I think we can all guess. The pain didn't go away. It just became chronic. The problem didn't resolve itself. It grew roots. It spread like a systemic infection.
Yeah.
And that agonizing period of, lingering uncertainty, it ultimately became far worse, far more costly and far more damaging to your reputation, to your mental health, than if you had just made that rapid, conclusive choice weeks or even months earlier.
That lingering uncertainty, that habitual choice of the half measure, that is the silent strategic flaw that absolutely destroys progress. It drains your psychological reserves, and as we'll see, it costs organizations millions. Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we unpack the sources you shared and distill the hidden truths of life mastery. Today, we are taking a monumental intellectual leap. We are bridging half a millennium of strategy. We're taking the brutal clarity of a 16th century political philosopher, Niccolo Machiavelli, and proving that his blueprint for power is the ultimate non-negotiable guide to, well, modern mental toughness, business efficiency, and achieving radical clarity.
Yeah, and our mission in this deep dive is to synthesize this really unlikely stack of sources into a single comprehensive and hopefully immediately applicable insight. We are focusing entirely on the unspoken rule of decisiveness. We're going to move from political science to contemporary psychological concepts like the Zeigarnik effect and the evolutionary imperative for cognitive closure.
Yeah.
And then we're going to apply all of that to the hard data, the really shocking data on the crippling cost of organizational chaos and indecision. Our ultimate finding, I think, is that the biggest risk you face in any endeavor isn't necessarily failure.
Right. Failure can be a lesson.
Exactly. Failure can be instructive. The real risk is debilitating hesitation, which is, it's merely wasteful.
Okay, let's unpack this with the core idea that underpins, I think, all of Machiavellian thinking. It's an observation so startlingly direct that it still forces us to confront some pretty uncomfortable truths about strategic action. His central mandate for effective leadership, and we're going to immediately translate this beyond 16th century politics to modern strategic management, is this. He says, men should be either treated generously or crushed, because they take revenge for slight injuries, for heavy ones they cannot.
It is, without a doubt, a famously severe axiom. But when we strip away the historical context, the talk of territorial control and all that, and we look at the underlying strategic logic, we realize it's fundamentally about consequential thinking. It's about strategic prevention.
Okay, so not malice for its own sake.
Not at all. The core idea is not about being cruel. It is about eliminating both the inherent capacity and the psychological motivation for a future threat or for, chronic instability.
That distinction there, the difference between what he calls a slight injury and a severe injury, that seems absolutely critical for our modern understanding. Because that vengeance threshold, that seems to be the pivot point. What exactly does he mean by a slight injury being more dangerous?
He is incredibly prescriptive on this. In any conflict, whether it's a political dispute, an internal corporate rivalry, or even a painful breakup, a slight injury is one that wounds but does not incapacitate.
Okay.
Think of it in a modern professional context. A frustrating, overly bureaucratic firewall rule that just hampers productivity.
Right, or a minor insult delivered in a meeting.
Exactly, or a small budget cut that annoys a department but doesn't actually halt their project. This small harm leaves the injured party with the means to retaliate. And crucially, it actively fuels the motivation to do so. The crisis is kept fresh in their mind, and they still have the leverage or the capacity to bite you back, maybe through gossip or sabotage, or even a later legal challenge.
So a slight injury is really the failure to truly resolve the situation. It's the equivalent of telling a low-performing employee, you need to improve, but then you don't give them any clear resources or consequences. So you leave them both frustrated and still employed, perfectly positioned to cause more issues down the line.
Precisely. The goal of any decisive action, according to this philosophy, has to be rapid, permanent behavior modification. If the tough action has to be done, it must be of such a kind that one does not stand in fear of revenge. And this translates to strategic action being clear, conclusive, and, if necessary, total, thereby removing the injured person's psychological or operational ability to mount a recovery or a successful retaliation. In Machiavelli's era, that meant neutralizing a threat completely.
Right.
In a business context, it means making a decision that completely resolves the issue, ensuring the affected party has no desire or means to keep the conflict alive, rather than leaving a smoldering, ambiguous fire.
But I have to push back a little on the premise that you can truly neutralize a modern threat. In a political context from 500 years ago, maybe. But if you terminate a key employee decisively, they still have the capacity to sue, to post negative reviews, to steal intellectual property. How do you neutralize that modern threat short of crushing them?
That's an excellent and very necessary clarification. We have to focus on the spirit of the principle, which is conclusiveness. The modern equivalent of crushing them means achieving an outcome where the individual lacks the motivation and the legal or strategic standing for revenge. For instance, if you must eliminate a project, you don't just pause it indefinitely. That's the half measure. You formally terminate it, you document the rationale, you pay out all the remaining contracts, and you transition all the intellectual property. The severity is in the administrative and legal finality. That finality removes the basis for a prolonged dispute. By contrast, a project that is merely on hold, well, it keeps its proponents motivated for revival, and it often just leaks resources and generates political instability within the organization.
And this is where it gets really compelling, because Machiavelli absolutely despised anything in the middle. He called it la via di mezzo, the middle way, and argued it was, quote, impossible or ruinous.
That is an extraordinarily strong rejection of compromise, which, many modern leaders see as a gold standard of management. Why such certainty that compromise guarantees failure? Because compromise, in his view, is inherently ambiguous. And ambiguity, over time, guarantees long-term failure because it just wastes time and resources. Machiavelli held up ideal political agents like the ancient Romans because they understood this. They avoided a middle course of action in serious matters, and they always turned to extreme measures for clarity and for speed. Weak states, on the other hand, are identified by being always ambiguous in their resolutions. This leads to the axiom that slow decisions are always harmful. They dither, they hedge their bets, and in doing so, they multiply their risk.
So the middle path isn't even seen as cautious. It's seen as dangerous incompetence because it prolongs the exposure to harm. But, many of us delay tough decisions because we are trying to find the best possible outcome.
And that is the trap that Machiavelli identifies. The ultimate evaluation of any decision or policy is not based on how it feels in the moment. It's based on its ultimate utility or loss, the harm or gain it produces. If the decision, even a painful one, ultimately brings a good result utility, the end will always absolve him from blame.
Because it works.
Because it works. So true political prudence, therefore, is not about maximizing immediate gain. It's not about finding the perfect solution. It is about recognizing the qualities of inconveniences, the inherent downsides of any serious decision, and strategically picking the less bad as good. It is a laser focus on mitigating future losses, not optimizing for immediate pleasure or consensus.
Wow, that flips the script entirely. We think of prudent leaders as those who are always gentle, seeking consensus, avoiding conflict. But Machiavelli argues prudence is recognizing that two options are terrible, but then choosing the least harmful one quickly and definitively. Can you give us an example of how a leader calculates that less bad decision in a modern context?
Sure. Consider a company facing the obsolescence of its core product line. They have two choices. Option A is to immediately shut down the non-performing division. This means a massive, painful, one-time restructuring cost and immediate layoffs.
Okay, that's the severe option.
Exactly. Option B is to keep the division limping along, funding it with hope, and a minor R&D budget for another 2 years, just hoping for a market turnaround. Option B, the half measure, feels gentler, but it is ruinous. It bleeds cash slowly, it demoralizes the entire company, and it consumes resources that could be funding the successful new product lines. Prudence demands choosing option A, the massive, painful, immediate cut. It is the less bad choice because it ends the bleeding, it frees up capital, and it provides immediate clarity for the rest of the organization to rebuild.
So the decisiveness itself becomes an asset, regardless of the severity of the action.
Precisely. And that focus on definitive action extends to alliances and conflicts, whether they are corporate power struggles or, international relations. Machiavelli's counsel here is absolute. You must avoid neutrality if the conflict concerns you. He stated bluntly that by declining to take sides, you acquire the reputation of a useless friend and a contemptible enemy. You effectively succeed only in making two enemies instead of just one.
That's a truly devastating consequence for trying to be the nice guy
Mm.
or the neutral third party in a serious conflict. How does that breakdown happen where you lose the respect of both sides?
It's all a matter of perception and what we can call the reputation test. Think about the two parties involved in the conflict. The victor who manages to win will never want you as an ally
Why not?
because you refuse to come to their aid when they face difficulty. They view your neutrality not as impartiality, but as unreliability and weakness. They believe they won despite you, not with you. And the loser, who perhaps expected your loyalty or your support, will regard you with cold fury because you just stood idly by and turned a blind eye to their distress.
So your decision to stand aside, the ultimate half measure in a conflict, is seen by everyone for what it is. It's self-interested cowardice or just irresolution.
Exactly. And the consequence is severe. You are disinclined to receive help or support in the future because your reputation has been fundamentally damaged. Machiavelli argued that being a true friend and a true enemy earns far more respect and strategic value than being neutral. Therefore, you should only maintain neutrality if you truly have no dog in the fight, if the conflict has no bearing on your resources, your interests, your stability, and if none of the combatants have a rightful claim on your loyalty. Only then can you act purely according to clear, calculated self-interest without incurring the reputational costs of betrayal.
Okay, so if Machiavelli provided the strategic blueprint for why the middle way is politically ruinous, modern psychology provides the neural wiring diagram for why it is so painful for the individual human mind. Because at the end of the day, all that painful lingering, the internal half measure, it all comes down to the brain's deep evolutionary need for finality, or what researchers call cognitive closure.
That's a crucial transition, because the individual mind is the most valuable asset being taxed by all this indecision. Our brain's drive for cognitive closure isn't just a mental quirk. It is a profound evolutionary survival instinct. If we trace our history way back, uncertainty often meant immediate danger.
Right.
If you didn't quickly decide if that rustling sound in the bushes was a predator or just the wind, well, your existence was legitimately at risk. As a result, the brain evolved a strong preference for fast, clear, and definite conclusions. Cognitive closure over slow, ambiguous analysis.
So ambiguity is literally uncomfortable for us because our ancient survival instinct equates prolonged uncertainty with being exposed and unsafe. We are wired to hate the maybe.
Precisely. Ambiguity feels unbearable. It's why, in modern life, when a serious email goes unanswered or you're waiting for a doctor's test results, our minds immediately rush to fill that silence. We generate negative stories. I've been fired. They're ignoring me. It must be the worst-case scenario. These narratives might be completely untrue, but they provide our anxious minds with something concrete to hold on to. We often trade truth for certainty.
Wow.
Preferring a harsh, definite answer over the sheer, paralyzing discomfort of not knowing what happens next.
It's the psychological tax of waiting. The decision to delay a definitive answer doesn't save us pain. It just pushes us into a self-destructive cycle of rumination to create our own answers.
Exactly. And research even backs this up in the professional sphere. It shows that this drive for closure isn't always about clarity. It's fundamentally about regaining a sense of control. Studies found that when people felt unhappy or insecure at work, the urgency for closure actually pushed them toward action-seeking solutions and problem-solving to resolve the instability. But when they felt content, that same drive made them resist change, preferring the current stable state.
So either way, the brain is trying to shut the door.
In both scenarios, the brain is attempting to shut the door on uncertainty, trying to regain a sense of control over the environment, whether by decisively charging forward or by digging in and avoiding new, potentially destabilizing data.
And this brings us to the precise psychological phenomenon created by the half measure, the Zeigarnik effect, which I call the open loop tax. Explain what this is and specifically how it actively taxes our mental bandwidth and our performance.
The Zeigarnik effect, named after the psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik, describes the brain's stubborn tendency to remember unfinished, interrupted, or uncompleted tasks far more vividly and persistently than finished ones. Her initial observation came from waiters who could perfectly recall unpaid orders, but immediately forgot the details of the checks that were already settled. These unresolved situations become open loops that demand active mental attention.
And these open loops are not passive background noise, are they? They're actively draining resources.
Oh, absolutely. They create intense mental tension or cognitive dissonance. The task remains active in your working memory, acting like cognitive clutter or intrusive thoughts that constantly pull your focus away from the task at hand.
I see.
The tension creates a persistent state of rumination, severely affecting your ability to perform unrelated, high-focus tasks. Working memory is a highly taxed, limited resource, essential for problem solving. Every open loop is essentially a tiny, low-priority process running in the background, slowing down everything else.
We feel this constantly. The unresolved conflict with a colleague, the unspoken emotions in a relationship, the project we never quite signed off on. They don't disappear when we go home. They actively linger and keep us from being fully present.
And the toll is quantifiable. One study found that employees who consistently had incomplete weekly tasks, so those operating with constant open loops, they experienced poorer sleep quality over a period of months.
Really?
Yes, due to heightened rumination and cognitive arousal. Their brain was literally keeping them awake, attempting to remind them that something still required attention and closure. A half measure isn't just a strategic failure, it's literally costing you deep restorative sleep.
So how do we shut this loop down? If I have a major complex task that I can't complete in one sitting, how do I achieve that closure without actually finishing it?
And this is the practical beauty of the research. The cognitive burden can be released not just by immediate completion, but by achieving closure through the dedicated act of planning. Researchers found that if you simply draft and commit to a specific actionable plan for the unfulfilled goal, if you take the time to break it down and externalize the steps onto a reliable to-do list, for instance, you release the cognitive burden.
So you're offloading it.
You are essentially moving the unresolved issue from the highly taxed working memory to the more passive but trusted external storage. This frees up mental resources for new pursuits because your brain trusts that a path to resolution has been established and documented.
That makes perfect sense. You're basically telling your brain, I hear you, I've acknowledged the task, and I have delegated the next steps to this reliable system so you can stop bothering me about it.
Exactly. It satisfies that deep-seated need for control and resolution, even if the final result is still distant.
Now let's connect that psychological vulnerability back to Machiavelli's minor injury. If a slight harm creates maximum psychological drag and motivation for revenge, how does modern neurobiology explain that dangerous resilience in the injured party?
We can link the minor injury principle directly to neurobiology through the brain's reward systems. A minor injury, a slight recoverable setback, or a slight against the ego, it provides the injured party with a reward opportunity. It activates the powerful human mechanism of anticipatory satisfaction. Studies have shown that the anticipation of revenge, or even just the detailed planning of a strategic comeback, activates the nucleus accumbens, which is a core structure in the brain's reward processing center.
So the leader who inflicts only minor recoverable harm is inadvertently fueling a cyclical fantasy. The victim gets a little hit of dopamine every time they plan their return, their lawsuit, or their gossip campaign. The minor injury is self-sustaining.
That's the psychological trap. It is a hedonically rewarding thought process that sustains motivation and aggression. Conversely, a severe, definitive action, the strategic crushing we talked about earlier, shatters the individual's perceived control and self-esteem to such an extent that they often enter a state of powerlessness or withdrawal. The sudden, definitive end effectively disables the reward mechanism associated with retaliatory fantasies, because the possibility of a successful comeback seems too remote or too difficult to sustain the reward cycle.
It sounds like the decisive action is psychologically more painful in the short term, but ultimately more merciful because it imposes clarity. It prevents the brain from engaging in that prolonged, destructive cycle of hostile rumination.
That clarity is the most valuable commodity. In the case of a half measure, the intent is ambiguous. The victim is forced to fill in the blanks with the most negative interpretation possible. They were trying to undermine me but were too weak to finish the job, or they were intentionally stringing me along. This ambiguity heightens their motivation to blame and creates a long-term destructive cycle of hostility. A radical, clear decision, though harsh, often provides a cleaner, more definitive boundary for the ego. It allows for emotional adjustment and eventual redirection, even if the outcome is negative. Ambiguity prolongs suffering. Decisiveness cuts the cord.
We've covered the 16th century political strategy and the 20th century psychology, and we're realizing that the internal tax we pay for open loops is enormous. Now, let's connect that internal cost to the external reality. The cost of organizational indecision in the 21st century workplace. Because the middle way is not just philosophically flawed or psychologically taxing, it's financially crippling. We are officially entering the segment I call Indecision is a $250 million disease.
That figure, which is derived from extensive McKinsey research on organizational efficiency, is a shocking manifestation of the half-measure principle applied to corporate structure. They estimated that inefficient decision-making, which is often just prolonged hesitation, costs an average Fortune 500 company over 530,000 lost working days and approximately $250 million in wasted labor costs per year.
That is an astonishing number. $250 million wasted annually. And to put that in human, highly relatable terms for the average knowledge worker, that translates to about 9 lost working days per employee annually, purely due to system inefficiency and the strategic paralysis of decision makers.
It is truly a silent, pervasive disease. And this inefficiency manifests in the internal environment as internal chaos.
Yeah.
The constant swirl of too many tools, scattered knowledge silos, tangled, non-standardized communication systems. It all escalates into a genuine, measurable strategic threat. This chaos, which is fundamentally fueled by hesitation and the refusal to establish clear, definitive standards, has 4 highly measurable impacts.
Let's break down those key impacts of unchecked chaos, because this is where the money goes. First up, the productivity drain caused by just searching.
Globally, knowledge workers lose about a quarter of their entire work week. That's 8 to 10 hours of time, just searching for the information they need to do their jobs. And this isn't high-level research.
No.
This is hunting for a file, checking an email chain for an approval, or logging into multiple platforms to find a single piece of data. Studies show employees are spending only 47% of their time on high-value, skilled work. The rest is eaten up by work about work, the relentless, low-value, busy work that is an invisible tax on the organization's P&L.
Second, decision-making slows to a crawl, which is the primary operational symptom of that strategic paralysis.
Absolutely. Vital information gets lost in transit, it gets buried in an internal labyrinth, or it lives only in the head of one specific hard-to-reach person, causing significant delays. Teams spend hours hunting down approvals or critical data points. One survey found that 55% of employees report hitting roadblocks, waiting on information from other teams before they can proceed. And the danger here is twofold. Either choices are made on incomplete data, which leads to bad outcomes, or they are simply postponed entirely, the ultimate half measure, which is just a recipe for consistently missed market opportunities.
Third, and this is highly indicative of the middle way failure, misalignment and duplication of work.
When communication is inefficient and clarity is lacking, different departments operate with different versions of the truth. They're often using their own favored tools and workflows without any centralized visibility. The result is pure, costly duplication. Over half of workers have unknowingly worked on the same task as someone else due to poor visibility across the organization. That means the resources that incurred that staggering $250 million annual cost are frequently being used to duplicate work, wasting skilled labor on problems already solved elsewhere.
And finally, the emotional cost, digital exhaustion, which leads directly to turnover.
The friction generated by this chaos is immense and mentally draining. Employees report switching between up to 35 different applications just to complete their daily jobs.
35.
It's a constant, jarring mental context switch. It is no surprise that 75% of workers report battling digital exhaustion. When everyday work feels like digital hide-and-seek, people burn out and disengage, leading directly to higher turnover and tensions and a workforce too drained by complexity to perform at its best. The organizational structure has inflicted the perfect slight injury, enough friction to annoy, but not enough clarity to resolve, fueling resentment and flight.
The message for leaders here is clear then. Tidying up your internal operations and committing to clarity is not just about efficiency. It's about survival and retaining talent. So, how do we apply that Machiavellian determination, that radical demand for speed, to this modern environment? What's the cure for corporate hesitation?
The modern strategic cure for hesitation is adopting the 70% rule. This principle, famously used in rapid decision-making environments, is the antidote to paralysis. It states that when you have about 70% of the information you wish you had, you must make the decision.
That requires accepting that you're going to be wrong 30% of the time, or at least operating with imperfect data. Most people find that terrifying.
That is the necessary trade-off. Speed and quality are demonstrably correlated. Organizations that decide quickly are twice as likely to make high-quality decisions compared to those that dither. Waiting for 90% or 100% certainty is waiting too long. You miss the market opportunity, or you allow the internal hectic fever of the problem to become incurable, just as Machiavelli warned centuries ago. You must decide and adapt rather than wait and be paralyzed.
And we have to revisit Machiavelli's counsel on the timing of action, which reinforces the 70% rule beautifully. He advised that injuries or tough actions, meaning necessary, painful decisions, ought to be done all at one time so that, being tasted less, they offend less.
This is a masterclass in change management. If you must execute a tough organizational restructuring, you should do it definitively, comprehensively, and quickly. Provide the necessary clarity, execute the changes, and offer generous severance or transition plans all at once. By contrast, benefits should be given little by little so the flavor of them may last longer. You don't want rolling layoffs or repeated restructurings that keep the entire company in a chronic state of low-grade fear. That rolling uncertainty, the half measure, is the real destroyer of morale.
Let's apply this counsel to personnel management, because this is where the half measure is often most toxic. We try to be nice, but we end up being cruel to the employee and strategically dangerous to the company.
The classic half measure here is the false positive. This occurs when a manager gives a low-performing employee misleading performance feedback like marking them as meets expectations or needs minor improvement, purely to avoid the emotionally difficult confrontation of a truly honest conversation.
The manager thinks they're being empathetic, but they are committing a deadly strategic error against both the employee and the organization.
Precisely. By choosing the half measure, the manager fails to provide the employee with a genuine developmental opportunity. That's the generous option. And fails to solve the underlying performance issue, the decisive action. This ambiguity leaves the employee in a state of confused complacency. It also subjects the company to massive future strategic and legal risks because they lack the necessary honest documentation to justify any later necessary termination. If you have to dismiss someone, you need to have a clear, documented history of non-performance, not a file full of needs expectations.
And what about the wider organizational impact of toxic, indecisive, or self-centered leadership? How does the minor injury of poor management lead to system-wide failure?
Well, toxic leadership, characterized by being unpredictable, self-centered, or communicating in a humiliating or ambiguous way, it creates emotional exhaustion and, crucially, organizational cynicism. Employees who feel this way adopt employee silence. They refuse to speak up, share critical knowledge, flag rising problems, or challenge poor decisions to management.
And why is that?
Because they have learned, through prior minor injuries, that speaking up is not rewarded and often leads to painful blowback.
So the minor injury of unpredictable or self-centered leadership creates a pervasive environment of silence that prevents the organization from detecting the major terminal problems. It's the hectic fever analogy playing out in real time, starving the organization of vital corrective information.
Exactly. That organizational silence prevents the detection and correction of errors. It hides incompetence and risks until they become terminal. Addressing these issues collectively, through transparent communication and definitive honest feedback, rather than relying on half-hearted, manipulative measures, is essential for long-term stability and health.
And this brings us to the ultimate administrative half measure, one that drains resources long after the work is theoretically complete. The failure to formally end a project. The operational cost of indecision is never clearer than in project management.
This is one of the least discussed but most important parts of the project lifecycle, the closing process group. It's the formal mechanism for achieving clarity and finality. Research indicates that more than half of all formal projects fail to meet the triple constraint of time, budget, and functionality. An effective closing process is considered a key factor in improving future success rates, yet it's often the first thing cut when teams are eager to move to the next thing.
Why is that closure so often ignored even though it's so critical?
Many practitioners view it as purely bureaucratic overburden, something done merely to satisfy administrative requirements. They define success solely as completing the deliverables on time and cost, and the project manager just moves on to the next assignment. However, failing to conduct a thorough closeout exposes the organization to two significant resource-draining risks, preventing it from realizing its anticipated benefits.
Let's detail the first risk, the never-ending project. What does that look like in practice?
This happens when a project fulfills its scope, the product is built, the system is installed, but it is never formally administratively transitioned to operations. Because the loop remains open, the rest of the organization continues to hold the original project management team responsible for maintaining, operating, and fixing the deliverables. And this is a crucial distinction. A project team is excellent at development and innovation, but not necessarily maintenance and long-term operations.
So the highly skilled developers and project managers are now stuck troubleshooting basic, low-value issues, which drains resources that should be focused on new strategic projects. It's organizational drag at its worst.
It is chronic resource depletion. The budget and expertise required to manage new high-value projects are consumed in low-value post-launch maintenance. And this severely limits the organization's capacity to meet its strategic objectives and innovate. The failure to make that definitive closing decision results in perpetual low-level chaos.
And the second problem, which is perhaps even more devastating, the orphan product.
This is a direct result of inadequate handover or transition to business as usual. When a new product or system is created, the operations, maintenance, and support teams need appropriate training, awareness, and tools. Crucially, they need to formally commit to their new ownership responsibility. If this doesn't happen, if that commitment loop isn't closed, the product, even if technically outstanding and revolutionary, can face rapid demise due to inadequate after-sales support, insufficient training for users, or a lack of long-term commitment from the people tasked with its survival. No one takes ownership, and the investment slowly withers away.
So the failure to perform a simple administrative, decisive act, formally closing the project and transferring responsibility, can risk the entire multi-million-dollar investment. How can organizations leverage decisiveness to prevent this and instead create exponential value?
Through the diligent, structured process of lessons learned. This is the strategic goldmine within the project closing process. Because projects are progressively elaborated, meaning we know very little at the start and much more at the end, the team gains unique knowledge about what worked, what failed, and why. By having a recurrent, structured lessons learned process, organizations capture and reuse that valuable experience for future projects. This ultimately reduces the time and cost to develop future products, reduces errors, and provides a wealth of documented best practices. This is the positive outcome of decisive action.
That makes the administrative closeout feel less like bureaucracy and more like strategic resource replenishment. But when is the right time to draw this decisive line? Must we wait until the very end?
Well, project closing must occur at the very end of the project, absolutely. But best practice dictates that closure and formal review needs to occur at every phase gate review in the project lifecycle. This is where the principle of decisiveness really shines in management.
That sounds like a lot of decision points, but it also sounds like a lot of control and reduced risk exposure. Walk us through why it is so strategically vital to force closure at every phase gate.
It is the maximization of control and benefit. The core purpose of these phase gate reviews is to review how the elapsed phase was performed and take an informed, definitive decision, a hard cut on whether or not to proceed to the next phase. This allows the project team to do several vital things, starting with the first. Eliminate scope creep.
How does formal phase closure kill scope creep?
By obtaining formal approval and sign-off from the sponsor and the customer for the completed work at the end of a phase, you officially baseline those deliverables. The agreement is, this phase is done, accepted, and closed. Any future changes to that accepted baseline work must then be managed as formal change requests or entirely new projects. This definitive process eliminates ambiguity and skepticism about what has been agreed upon, which is the very friction point where scope creep thrives.
Okay, the second vital function must be validating the business case.
This is critical for strategic alignment. Projects are progressively elaborated, but the business environment is constantly changing, sometimes rapidly. The phase gate review allows the team to periodically validate two core things. Is the project justification still valid? And will the project still meet the financial and strategic requirements we set out? If the business case is no longer relevant, perhaps a competitor released a product first or market forces shifted, the decision might be made to terminate the project decisively, thereby avoiding further wasted resources on a guaranteed failure. The half measure here would be allowing the project to continue, knowing it won't deliver maximum value.
The third function, managing contracts and procurements.
You must review all contractual obligations with external parties at the end of a phase. Was all the work completed for that phase? Were all payments made according to the terms? Did the contractor provide all supplementary deliverables, like documentation or warranties? You obtain final approval for that phase of work. ensuring that all parties have satisfied their obligations, which prevents unnecessary delays or future liability for the organization down the road. It forces clarity on external dependencies.
And finally, the fourth benefit, capturing those lessons learned in real time.
By closing the loop at the end of every phase, you force the documentation of lessons learned while the information is still fresh and the pain or success is still vivid. Waiting until the end of a 3-year project means key insights are forgotten or the original team members have moved on. Recurrent forced closure turns the project cycle into a rapid, self-correcting engine of continuous improvement. This process of closing the loop at every phase is the definition of strategic determination applied to management, maximizing value while ruthlessly mitigating risk.
Oh, so let's bring it all back to the core unifying lesson. Machiavelli's mandate to treat well, which means generous support and clear communication, or decisively eliminate, which means conclusive action, is a principle of radical clarity and consequential thinking. The sources all point to the same truth. The greatest threat to success, efficiency, and mental health is ambiguity.
The half measure, the constant deferral, the ambiguous communication, the failure to formally close a process, it keeps the hectic fever of the problem alive, draining psychological, financial, and organizational resources until they reach a point of systemic collapse. Decisiveness, while often perceived as harsh or incredibly difficult in the short term, emerges as the most ethical and efficient path in the long run. It provides essential clarity for everyone involved, whether it's an employee needing honest performance feedback, a competitor needing a definitive market response, or a project team needing a clear mandate to move forward or simply be finished. If you are going to take an action, it must be a conclusive action that leaves no room for confusion or lingering resentment.
We've established that the cost of indecision is quantifiable in hundreds of millions of dollars wasted and hundreds of thousands of days lost to internal chaos. But I want you to consider the greatest cost of all, which we found in the psychological sources: the immense toll of the open loops you refuse to close in your personal life.
That Zeigarnik effect is a silent, ruthless thief of focus and peace. If you are waiting for 100% certainty, if you are stuck in that ambiguous middle way in your career or a key relationship, you are already too slow. And your brain is paying the tax of relentless rumination, distraction, and poor sleep.
So ask yourself right now, what painful, half-finished item in your life or in your organization is still haunting your mind, acting as an open loop, and how much longer will you allow that uncertainty to steal your focus, your energy, and your true potential? The final rule of total life mastery is that you can't level up until you close the loops and commit fully to the choice you make. If this deep dive gave you the courage and the conviction to make that decisive cut, then don't let this be another uncompleted task. Crush the like button if you prioritize radical clarity over chronic chaos. Decisively comment below with the one open loop you are finally closing this week, the definitive decision you are making now. Subscribe to the deep dive because we refuse to let you operate on half measures, and ring that notification bell because if you delay, you risk losing the next unspoken rule forever. We'll see you next time.